All right. Pat Riley likes to say he works in the toy department of human affairs, and that couldn't be more true after following that. I feel very feeble being up here talking about sports and basketball, and but it's important stuff because a lot of the stories I work on at ESPN, these issues don't get talked about until it's on SportsCenter or until it's on ESPN.com or until it's on CNN. And a lot of these issues of sleep, nutrition, workloads, privacy, all come together in the NFL and NBA, which we have representatives from all those. I'd like everyone to just introduce yourselves real quick. We have like 20 minutes, so start with you, Ahmad.
I'll go first. Ahmad Nassar, I'm president at the NFL Players Association, running our commercial business. Just to echo Tom's comment about how humbling and frankly a little embarrassing it is to follow both the panel just before us and before that, and thank you all, whether you're on the panel or in the audience, for your service.
Joe Rogowski, Director of Sports Medicine for the National Basketball Players Association. My role with the union is I'm sort of that in-between person for the lawyers and the players and the team. So I help, the communication between all the sides so that everybody understands each other and so we don't have issues and put out fire. And I'll put out the fires before they happen, hopefully.
Donald Foyle, I am the community ambassador for the Golden State Warriors, former NBA player and former executive of the Players Association.
Will Ahmed, founder and CEO of Whoop. Really, our mission at Whoop is to unlock human performance. So we've built a system across hardware, software, and analytics designed to monitor the human body. And we work with many professional athletes, collegiate athletes, Olympians, and look forward to talking about that more.
So let's talk about that because you guys signed a deal with the NFLPA to have all the, you and Ahmad. A few years ago, I didn't know what Whoop was. I don't even know if it was it a company back in 2014?
We existed, yeah.
And now suddenly you have a deal with the top sport in America, the Players Union from that. How did you seek out him? How did you find out about Whoop? And was this initiative that you were thinking about for a long time to align with a company like Whoop?
I'll start by giving the NFLPA credit in that I think Ahmad and his team were pretty forward-thinking about the fact that data and sensors are becoming part of sports, and better understanding the human body I think is an important mission for any players association, any league. And Ahmad and his team put together a group called One Team Collective, which I think was really designed to evaluate technology companies. So Whoop was fortunate to go through that process and ultimately competition and to be successful in it and ultimately partner with the NFL Players Association to become the official recovery wearable of the NFLPA. So Whoop is now being distributed to every player in the NFL for the next 5 years. And it's an opportunity to really better understand these athletes' bodies and work closely with the PA to also generate revenue around that deal.
Yeah, and my turn to give credit to Will and his team. That's how this works. By the time we were talking about working with Whoop in the NFL context, they had already piloted, I believe, a study with MLB and involving minor league players. They'd already gotten approval to be worn or were in the midst of getting approval to be worn on the field, which is currently in place for this baseball season. And so there was a clear interest in aligning with sports. But I think perhaps as importantly, Will, and just talking through Whoop's vision for the business and wearables in general, it was not centered on only the elite of the elite athletes. It was a growth story that even filtered down to somebody like me, who's about as far from a professional athlete as you could be.
And Donald, would you want wearables? Like if you knew that you had access to Whoop as a player, is that something you'd be interested in? Or are you like, I don't want my team, or I don't want any of my data, sleep data, recovery data. I don't want anyone to see that just for me.
Well, I think if I can speak for a bunch of the players, the issue is always a question of like how the information is used, right? So I think as a player, you're on the cutting edge of sport. You're in one of 450 of the best players in the world. So you want to be on the cutting edge. But if somebody comes in and said, I want to take data, and that data is going to go upstairs, and you're going to give an executive power to make decisions about, well, I don't think you're a good sleeper, so I'm going to cut you. You know, it's different, right? So the question becomes, how is that data being used? How is it protected? How is players' identity protected? How is ensuring that a player privacy is intact, while at the same time making advances in technology to enhance the sport and to enhance probably the capability of a player's career.
And in the NBA CBA, it's very important for you guys to have protection on that front.
Yeah, and I'll say it's interesting because O'Donnell used to be one of my players when I worked for a team, and I hooked him up to everything imaginable. So he was my lab rat always, and it's sort of like a prosecutor going to the defense side. So I sort of understand that whole side of the team and investing in science and researching stuff on O'Donnell mostly. So it's now that I'm on the other side, the union side, I look at things a little bit differently, and I feel for our players, because you want to empower them, and any way we could make them healthier and extend their career, is obviously first priority. But having said that, there's a lot of other things that come into play. It's not just a simple, hey, these guys, hook these guys up to this. There's again, now that I'm in this position, you see the different layers, the commercial side, the legal, the ethical side, the practicality, is it valid, reliable? And all these things need to be taken into consideration before, you work with these athletes that are very high publicized athletes. So I think that's sort of the route that when I started with the union that I wanted to take is, all right, let's do our due diligence in this area because it is coming and it's coming fast.
I mean, I know a couple players are wearing whoops in the NBA, and they weren't allowed to do that, but they did it anyway because I think a lot of these players are curious about their workloads. Should teams have that data? Should teams know, hey, my star player only slept 5 hours last night. I should probably pull back on the workload at practice. Should teams have that access to that data?
I mean,
I'm with O'Donnell.
And I'll say this. I mean, it's tough because we look at these players and we know everything about them. They're followed with TV cameras all day. So we sometimes forget that this is their livelihood. Much like you have your job. If you were being monitored, everything that you were doing at work, you'd probably have a problem with that. So there is a line that we need to be careful so we don't overstep it. It's a little bit different. The tough thing is this millennial generation, unfortunately, everything is out there on Twitter and that with them. So it's important to educate them that how some of these numbers and if they're not valid and reliable could actually potentially hurt them.
I think it's dangerous because we're not at a point yet to really know what to do with the data, even if people have access to it. Two easy examples, the folks who presented before us talked about how they're not at a point yet to know which 230 out of 1,000. It's not as simple as saying, well, who ran a fastest mile or any of those metrics. And if the Chicago Bulls 20 years ago had access to Michael Jordan's data before his flu game, they might have thought about sitting him out entirely, yet he went out and scored over 50 points, right? I think it was over 50. So it's not, there isn't quite yet the ability to properly turn that data into action. And even if there was, the example you gave was a good one, which is, okay, do we alter practice regimens based on data and recovery? But it's not hard at all to think of the bad examples, and O'Donnell gave the paramount concern, which is this going to be used against me in contract negotiations? But there's all sorts of other bad manifestations of that. And yeah, I think it's very important that we be careful, and I think we're at a stage right now where the law hasn't really caught up to where the technology is.
The one thing I'll add, and I understand everyone's point of view, I mean, we also work with teams directly as well. And I think what's important as you think about any kind of data sharing between teams and athletes or trainers and athletes is a real transparency around what's actually being shared. You know, I think if there's anything we've learned from social networks to date, it's that you know, data sharing is not binary. It's not like you're sharing everything about your body or nothing, right? And in the case of Whoop, I mean, we've really taken strides to actually have 27 different layers of what actually can be shared between a coach and an athlete or a trainer and an athlete. And so from that standpoint, I don't view it's necessarily our role to determine who owns the data between a coach or a team and an athlete, but it is our role as a technology company to make sure that it's really transparent what is ultimately being shared, and also to make sure that there's enough layers there so that a coach and a player or a trainer and a player can find the optimal level such that both parties have some benefit and both parties find an optimal arrangement in the partnership.
Can I just jump in for a
Yes.
second? Well, I just, part of it to me is always seen with you guys, the NFL and the NBA. Okay, so everyone should want a player to train better, not undertrain, not overtrain, perform longer. That's in everybody's interest, the business interest, the player's interest. Yet it seems like there's such a fundamental lack of trust, particularly in the NFL, between the league and the player. And so how do you do anything with that kind of lack of trust?
The NFL, right, uses Zebra technology to track players on the fields, and then players are partnered with a different company. And I don't think there's no centralized bridge between those two systems. So
Not yet, but
that's
folks are working on it. Yeah.
how do you bridge that gap, not just in terms of technology, but also in the culture of where the coach is on the same team, one team collective, same team as the players, where we all want to come together to get you as healthy as possible?
I think the first part of your question answers the second part, which is the more we can unlock the potential of the data and wearables that are out there to collect it, to prolong careers, to make the careers safer, to make the sport safer, which is all in our collective interest. I don't think we're ever going to get to the point, and I'm okay with it, that we trust the league entirely and they trust us entirely. But what I do care about is that it doesn't get in the way of what should otherwise be in everybody's best interest. And I have personally seen many teams, or maybe just one, Atlanta, talk about using data, and this I think is very interesting, using data to enable them to recruit free agents better. So meaning usually right now, and this is still the case in the NFL, and I believe in the NBA, that by and large, if you pay me $1 more than any other team, I'm generally going to take that, with some notable exceptions, I think more in the NBA than in the NFL. And what the Falcons have been focused on doing, or at least talking about, is being able to go to a free agent in football and say, on average, you will play a year longer if you sign with the Atlanta Falcons. And we have the data to prove it. And that is going to be extremely interesting to the players, to their families, maybe not their agents because they're paid a commission of what they're, but in the long run, it's in their interest. And so I think that's where it starts to get really interesting. And you know, all sports are copycat sports. The minute the Falcons are better able to attract free agent talent, other teams are going to start copying in order to, and so it's more of a bottom-up approach. Very rarely does a top-down approach work, at least in the NFL, where the NFL says, hey, we're all going to do this, go do it. And in fact, the Zebra data is interesting because there's been stories over the last few months that the teams get this huge pile of data every year with all of the coordinates of the players on the field. And most of the teams have no idea what to do with it, and they don't do anything with it. They just get it in the mail, and you know, they got it. So I think it's got to be the other way around, where it's all it is in everybody's interest to be able to really unlock that.
So I think one of the things that is interesting is that for me is that I see the compiling of data sitting there as inherently problematic because information is not lost, it's there. And it's not just general information, it's information in people's personal life, right? And I think that the other part of it is that there's been such a tremendous amount of technology coming into our space that we forget the most common thing in sports, which is interaction. You can learn a lot of data just from talking to the players, but people have become so consumed with the information collection that the art of having a conversation and building rapport is lost. And I think if that becomes the case, then you're making decisions basically just on data, not on the person's heart, not by getting input from them and judging that. And I think to me, that has been part of the side effect. I don't think that by any means that that information collection is a bad thing. But I do think what is lost is our ability to communicate with our players. And you've seen that where we lost just the basic sense of saying, let's go have a cup of coffee and talk about what's going on in your life, rather than let's use the computer to figure out, tell me everything that I need to know about what's going on in your life. And I think
that
that's
creates a
balance.
distrust, right?
Exactly.
If they're strapping on machines into you, not having a personal conversation with you, that creates a...
At least Joe talked to me when I was a lot,
The coach
came to the
made me.
machine.
And Donald's spot on that. And that's one of the things that we have to be careful with this advancement in technology is we're losing the whole coaching and the communication side of it, which is the most important part of it to be successful. We've almost gotten to the point where someone will come up and say, oh, look at this guy's resume, this, and this. And I'll be like, great, can he talk? And unfortunately, there's a lot of very, very, very smart people out there that can't communicate. And when you're in this, in our world specifically, you have to talk to the players. You have to communicate. You're a teacher. And you need to be able to teach them these things that you just can't show them numbers. So that's the most crucial part of any of this technology being successful is educating the guys, being able to communicate with them, put it in a way that they can understand it, which sometimes gets forgotten about because we're so on this technology train that we forget about the most important part.
The one thing I'll add though is, I think the technology that you guys are being critical of from a communication standpoint, is the same thing that's in every person's pocket right now, right? That's not necessarily sensors and data that's being collected on players. And actually, if you look at the data that's being collected, in particular in the NBA, overall, it's actually pretty small. Like, this is not like a widespread...
You're not taking blood from the players.
Yeah. If you compare NBA, for example, to Premier League soccer, it's like completely different spectrums, right? So, I totally hear what you're saying. I just think that also some of what you're reflecting is the fact that like people are just on their phones all the time, and that's more of a phenomenon across every generation.
And I think part of it too is that I've been in a situation where a team official comes in and say, "I want your saliva." Right?
Yeah.
Not having a conversation about what are you going to use that saliva for? What is it? What are you doing with my information?
Probably.
I think that's important as well. Is that if you don't educate I think the athlete is very much a consumer as a team, and I think that the misconception is that we've been having a lot of movement towards influencing the team, and not realizing that every individual athlete is now a corporation unto themselves, and that you have to recognize that brand, that those players is just as important. And if you can empower that player is going to be a long-term consumer in a much more different way than the ownership would, right? Who has different interests. I think that it's just understanding the motivation that goes into that decision matrix, that the player represents both the labor and the product. And therefore is that you have to educate them, and very much you educate a coach about how to use the amount of data that they have available to them, which many of them cannot use.
Tom, we have microphones for the Q&A.
Q&A, questions. I feel like we just got started.
Yeah. Sorry.
Any questions out there?
Thanks. In terms of player adoption, have you guys considered introducing technology into the developmental leagues or like the G League, where the players are looking to get noticed and looking to perform better? So the buy-in would be, I can represent a better product, and I know what makes me play better, and this device then helps them get noticed, helps them get drafted, and then after a couple of years, the teams will be made up of people who all got there because of how they were able to perform better because of greater knowledge and data that was collected.
So to back up a sec, it's a great question. Gatorade has sponsored the NBA's formerly known as the D-League, and now It is the G League. And so as part of that partnership, it has a Gatorade logo. As part of the partnership, it is the GSSI, the Gatorade Sports Science Institute, can run assessments, sweat tests on the G League players. And so there is this innate partnership with the G League and sports science and measuring a lot of their biometrics. So just to give you background on that.
Yeah, I mean, I can say from our standpoint, we do now have clients like in professional sports working with their farm leagues where, it's an opportunity, one, for them to start to understand the data, two, for the trainers to start thinking about how they would use the data. And what we often see, too, in rolling Whoop out is that the athlete himself or herself gets pretty hooked on the understanding of sleep and recovery and strain for the first time. I mean, it's amazing how far professional athletes can get in their careers without ever monitoring some of the most fundamental things about how they're going to perform. So there is this eureka moment when they get access to some of that data. And there's also good testing grounds too, right? Like, are players comfortable wearing it? How does it change? How does it change the locker room conversation, if at all? What sort of behavioral changes do you see? So generally speaking, I'm very supportive of teams that look to do that.
Yeah, what I think is interesting about that question, it touches on the ability to empower players to march in to those contract negotiations and say, I'm a good sleeper, or I recover well, or I
eat well.
Not in team meetings, but when I'm supposed to be sleeping. And that's interesting because that could potentially lead to a virtuous cycle where other players say, oh, wait, O'Donnell got signed and he was able to walk in there and talk about how great his data set was, and I either didn't even have a data set or I had one that wasn't that great and I kind of tried to bury it. And so it's interesting when viewed from that perspective, that suddenly becomes a lot more palatable to somebody like me. But the concern is still going to be there. Who has access to it, and what are they doing with it?
And we have a question in the middle here. Go ahead.
Yeah, so a lot of what you're talking about, and Dr. Saxon mentioned trust, and so that gets into the data governance. And I'd offer that it's a very different industry, but there's some parallels. In the airline industry, on safety, there's an organization that is a third-party organization that gets information on the pilot's performance, the airline performance, and near misses, and collectively from all the Airline Pilots Association is involved, the airlines are involved, and they've figured out a way to de-identify that data so that you don't share competitive information, and also you're not reviewing individual performance on a pilot, on pilots, but collectively it improves the performance and safety. And so I think as you think about some of the challenges you're talking about with trust, thinking about third-party data governance and how you do that and the process for who has access could be helpful.
And in the NBA, we've done somewhat of that with the wearables committee that we established after the CBA, where we've set out to different universities a chance to be the third-party tester of all these different wearables, so that we could see, so we could take a good educational look at it and see if they're valid, reliable devices. So, we can't say, it's skewed because that side's doing it, and they can't say it, on our side. So we do have that third party in place for the wearables.
On the NFL side?
We're working on that. I think the fascinating aspect of the airline example is, one, it worked over the last 20, 30 years. The incidents of pilot error have decreased tremendously, and we can compare to the rest of the world where places haven't necessarily opened up to doing that. But the linchpin of that program was enabling the pilots and co-pilots to feel free to report without fear of any sort of retribution. And I think that's the nut we're trying to crack in football at least. And I think there is a role for third-party validators, absolutely.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I'm in the healthcare biotech sector, so data is a key part of my everyday life. But I'm a bit cautious about the points that you've raised. For example, sleep. You brought up sleep a few times. There are individuals who need 9 hours of sleep in order to function properly, and then there are people who need 6 hours of sleep or could function with less. So one thing that I want to ask, are you considering doing baseline for each person rather than doing an inter-individual comparison? Because I think that's when you would kind of get into some issues and you would potentially exclude the people who would be good performers, because we all know there are people who are very good on paper, but they may not be very good in person or real life when it comes down to performance. So how do you avoid excluding people who fall into that category with what you're proposing?
Will, I
The
think
use
you-
of data.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. And so just to be clear, the way we think about sleep monitoring, we actually baseline everyone when they get on the platform. So within 3 days, 7 days, and 30 days, we have a different perspective on your personal baseline. And every night we give you what we effectively deem to be a sleep need before you go to bed, to quantify how prepared we think you are to recover for tomorrow. And we actually think about sleep performance solely through the context of how many hours of sleep of the need that you had did you actually get. And indeed, we do have athletes on our platform who need 6 hours of sleep to recover properly. And we have athletes who need, in some cases, over 10 hours. And so a lot of it, I think, is understanding the individual that you're dealing with. And I think that's an opportunity where, again, the right data, if measured accurately, can help coaches, trainers, or even the athlete himself better understand his body.
Sorry, if I can ask one more thing. In terms of, let's say, biomarkers, if you do choose to go into the biomarker route, I bring up an example of allergy testing. If you live in Southern California, you're most likely allergic to at least 5 things. So getting an allergy test, you could potentially test positive for a different number of things, but that doesn't mean that either one of them is going to kill you. So having these kind of, I wouldn't call them false positive, but positive on certain things that may not have that big of an impact, and then looking at those and making decisions based on that. How do you plan on filtering through what I would call noise?
That's a difficult question because we're just starting that process. But I will agree with you on this. One of the main issues that I see that happens a lot is there's so many variables that can affect one data point, and especially when you're talking about just the human body. And that's the thing that sometimes we need to take a step back and look at the whole picture. And I know front office people just want a number. And that's not realistic. And they just, is there a readiness score? Is he a 5 or 6? And like you said, there's a lot of variables that come into play, and that's where, back to Donald's point, where the communication is probably the most critical part. So if I could go up to a player, I would see their numbers when they'd come in, and I'd, talk to him and how you feeling, and he would tell me he got in a fight with his girlfriend the night before, and he wasn't. I wouldn't, put him on, oh, this guy's inactive, he can't play. So that's where that part's very crucial to figure out what are the variables that affect that one data point. It's a tough question, and I don't think anyone has that answer yet. But I think now that we understand that that is a problem, we can start looking at solutions to it.
You just hit the game winner. Buzzer hit.
No, all right.
Would you join me in welcoming and thanking and saying thanks to each and every one of these presenters? Thank you so much.